Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I know I'm sitting between you and lunch, and I don't want to be the one to blame. So when I was given this title of what we need to talk about, I decided that I need to take you through a journey of what capacity building means, and through that, learn some of the lessons that we have learned, especially at the continental level. There are speakers who have come before me, especially yesterday. We had a lot of insightful knowledge that was impacted with us from the keynote speaker. And one of the slides that was presented by Abdul Hakim looked at capacity building as a key issue that needs to be looked at. So let's try and understand something about capacity building. It is important to really have a grasp. What is capacity building? And I know there are so many other definitions out there that you could go and look at, but capacity building has to be understood in a number of connotations. First, you have to understand it as a function that you want to make sure that an institution that is accountable is able to take that particular effective methodology, whether it is from cybercrime or cyber capacity, to ensure that you are able to strengthen your country's resilience. So it could be cyber capacity building in terms of education, it could be equipment, it could be knowledge impacting, but the commonality is resilience across the piece. So that's very, very important that we have to understand that. So cyber capacity, and you can have different definitions that takes that to the next level, whether it's international level or whatever level that you want to take it, but at this level, it's important that we understand that. There are various ways that we've seen capacity building. We've just had Interpol talk to us about capacity building. This is an example of capacity building in ECOWAS, where the ECOWAS community with the EU have partnered to have capacity building within Africa. And there's no shortage of this type of initiatives. We have other initiatives, which I think the gentleman just talked about, of Interpol having capacity building activities and initiatives within Africa. And in all these, it's a partnership between different parties to make sure that you can build capacity. And we've seen that also with the AU and the AU-GFCE, that we've seen that, and also under the AU-SEG, where they're trying to build capacity in terms of building a strategy across Africa that can be used. Therefore, there's no shortage of initiatives. And these initiatives always have a north and south. That means countries that have the capability, institutions that have capability, coming to the institutions or countries that do not have that particular capability and joining up forces so that you can build capacity. But there are specific challenges that we have to understand. So let's try and see what are these issues when it comes to capacity issues. So the first issue that I have, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just based on experience, working in different African countries, and of course, other countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So there's the issue of cohesion, cooperation, coordination, which normally lacks when it comes to capacity building at a national, regional, or even continental level. And here, we are specifically looking at Africa. So there's something missing every time. We have to make sure that when we want to build capacity, we don't duplicate. You don't waste resources. Duplicity, waste of resources, because you get a country, a certain agency comes and does project Y, another agency comes and does the same project that another agency is already doing. You end up duplicating tasks. You end up wasting resources. So there's a need to have a cohesive way of how we can build capacity. There's a second issue, which is the issue around coordination among continental and also international institutions. And this is something that the GFCE, where I do actually a lot of work with, we've learned these lessons so that all the donor agencies, development partners, donor countries, they come together to understand the problem and know who is doing what, at what part of the world, who is doing what with who, so that you don't have this duplicity and waste of resources. So that's important from the source. It's also important at the recipient. What do you do at the recipient? You've got to come together. You've got to understand each other so that you don't compete for resources that are the same. You would rather have complementary resources within a specific agenda. So therefore, pursuing a digital agenda requires us to be very cohesive, requires us to be very coordinated, and requires us to be able to understand what other departments are doing, agencies or ministries. There is also this issue of policy and regulation. So if, for example, you don't have a data protection and privacy law, there are some things that might not be possible. Or if you don't have a specific regulation, there's some things that might not be possible. So therefore, how do we make sure we do that? You must have progressive policies, progressive regulation that is able to foresee what you're trying to achieve. Otherwise, it becomes an impediment. So there's an issue that you have to be aware of. So therefore, the issues around how you make sure that you coordinate around capacity building also has to be reflected in the fiber of your policies, in the fiber of your regulation as a country. And then, of course, we've got the issues about shortages of finance, which is very common as a challenge, which we always see from time to time. Mentoring is also an issue, training, and so forth. But in this case, these are good challenges because that's why you have capacity building, to make sure that you can address them. But sometimes they impede the process of capacity building because you have to train people from a certain perspective going forward. And then lastly, of course, is the issue of the high cost of access for specific connectivity, high cost of access when it comes to availability and connectivity. So these are some of the challenges that I think we need to put in mind when we talk about capacity building. But let me take you through the project that I understand very well, and I'll take you through some of the lessons that we've learned and how we are going about this particular project. So I'll talk about the AU-GFCE collaboration project. It's supposed to end in October, and I think Kenya is a participatory. I know there's so many other countries that are represented here, and if your country is not represented, please see me after this, and we'll have a discussion. So there are two teams here. So you've got the African Union and the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise. We also have colleagues from NEPAD who are participating in this project. And thankfully, we also have funding from the Belinda Gates Foundation, who have actually provided the support to make sure that this particular collaboration takes place. It is a big team, so I've got people behind me, so I'm not the only one here, so I lead a bigger team of other individuals who are behind me, and we are working across different parties. Some of you might know some of these individuals, and we're also working in partnership with NEPAD, and my colleague, Dr. Tawela, she's also someone whom we've worked very well. So there's a huge team behind this particular initiative, and they are very, very dedicated individuals with very, very good talent working around this particular project. Hence the reason why it's important that we understand what are we doing in this project and what have we learned going forward, okay? Essentially, you've got two communities. You've got the GFCE community and you've got the African Union community. And in these two communities, they are big in their essence. So one consists of AU development agencies, you've got regional economic communities, especially when it comes to the AU, you've got AU specialization. And in fact, somebody talked about all these organizations the other day. And then, of course, in the GFCE, you've got member countries, and I think Kenya, because we are in Kenya, of course, is a member of the GFCE. We've got individual organizations here that are also members of the GFCE. You've got donor agencies, development partners, and also you've got civil society and international organizations that are part of this. So all these organizations have come together to say, okay, how do we make sure we enhance cyber capacity in Africa. So the aim of the project, and of course for those who speak French, there's a bit of translation for you, it's essentially to enhance capacity building knowledge in AU member states, and in so doing, building resilience across cyber. So there's a way that we wanted to make sure that we can build capacity in member states. The question was how? There were 3 stages to this. So the first stage was to understand the priorities of the countries. Because we are aware many of the countries had COVID. They changed their priorities. Most of the funding, the concentration went to COVID, health. Some countries compete. You've got transport, you've got education, you've got agriculture. They compete cyber. The lady from Kitui County, she said they fight to make sure that they get resources for ICT. So therefore, cyber is never considered unless there's a crisis. So there was funding, the priorities. We needed to understand what was the priority, what is the priority of African countries? And I'll share with you some information of how we did that. The next issue is the issue around building expertise. How do we make sure that the project does not become what we call a white elephant, or a project that belonged to this organization, or a project that was brought by this organization, but the build-up, the uptake is taken up by our own individuals. So therefore, we needed to build what we call an Africa cyber expert community. If you are seated here and you're not aware of this expert community from your country, come and see me, so that you become part of this particular fiber. It were to build that expert community, so that any other time there is a requirement that is similar to this in terms of knowledge, the experts can be drawn from the continent, not from the north, not from any other place, but from the continent, so that you've got south to south infusion of knowledge. Then the third issue was to build what we call the knowledge modules. These are what we call best practice or good standards that will enable any other practitioner to understand cyber capacity building challenges and opportunities in specific focus areas. And I'll show you how we went through identifying the focus areas. So those are the 3 fundamental, and I'll talk a little bit more why this third component is important. So the way we did it is to first of all understand the priorities of the countries. So what you see on the left were items that the GFCE in 2015, 2016, during the daily communique, agreed that these are the same areas that we need to look at. So you've got things to do with national cybersecurity strategy, CERTs, legislation, awareness and outreach, cybersecurity standards, and even at the top one, we had cyber norms and cyber diplomacy to make sure that we can understand. So those were the general areas. Then we discussed these issues within the GFCE community, looked at existing the repositories that contain information around each of the countries so that we could be able to understand what that meant to those countries. So for example, I think we talked to Kenya, and we had a lot of discussion with the Kenyans. We talked to Ugandans. We had a lot of discussion with Ethiopians. We've talked to Niger. We've talked to Cameroonians. We've talked to Ghanaians. We've talked to all the countries in Africa, the 54 countries, to understand what their priorities are. And in so doing, we came up with a metric that enabled us to make sure that all these countries that we've talked to, that they've participated in this particular process, were able to understand their priorities. And those priorities, we've tried to look at them in depth because we were able to compare from different repositories that exist. What you see at the top there, that is the CMM assessment, and I know some of you are aware of that. There is the ITU GCI assessment, We've got an assessment from eGov. There's an assessment by NEPAD, and Luxembourg conducted an assessment. And by doing that, we were able to compute how many assessments have been done per each country based on this particular metric, starting from 2019 going onwards. And we were able to come up with some standardization. So when you look at the CMM, for example, we now understand up to 2020 how many countries had already done CMM assessment, how many countries do not have CMM assessment, and how many countries are yet to have a CMM assessment. So if your country doesn't have what we call a CMM assessment, please try and talk to me and we can be able to see whether you might have that done. Of course, this is a method for assessing gaps in cybersecurity strategy development process. You can use that methodology, or you can use a different methodology to assess your gaps. The other aspect is to look at the ITU. Now, let me be very clear. These tables were presented by Abdul Hakim. He presented the one on the left. But ideally, ITU has a different grading. Africa region, for ITU, it means sub-of-Sahara. But they also have Arab states region. So therefore, the second country in Africa is not Tanzania. It is actually Egypt. So you just have to make sure that that's correct, in the African continent. So that's something that I just wanted us to be clear. But in any case, we looked at this data to understand where countries are. And in doing that, it gave us a clear idea where they stand when it comes to the priority areas. So therefore, we have a clear understanding of what the priorities of the countries are. So we've come up with some metric. This is an example or a snapshot of the metric. And this metric tells us quite a lot of things. It says, for example, those two areas, SAT development, issues to do with awareness, are the most critical for the countries because they are of priority in each of those. But each country is different. So for example, if you take Gambia, Gambia has all the needs. They need all those. So they want something on other priorities. They've got issues to do with standards. But it might not be the same as probably Rwanda, which only needs a few. The need for each country varies in terms of the priorities that they have and based on what they've already invested in. So that's something that we've learned out of that. And then, of course, going forward, we've made sure that, I think my slide doesn't. Yeah, going forward, we needed to understand what was key in each of these. Now, reviewing of the national cybersecurity strategy was a priority in a number of countries, but as I said, the two top ones were the main priorities for each of the countries. I really want to emphasize cyber norms and cyber capacity is a critical area. And for those of you who are here and you're wondering which area of career you might want to go to, I can give you some piece of advice. Try and start concentrating on cyber norms, and cyber diplomacy, because we have a shortage of skill sets. And this has been repeated across the theme of this particular forum since yesterday. We have a shortage of skill sets. People who understand both the technical in terms of cyber capacity, but also cyber norms and cyber diplomacy, the diplomacy and the cyber itself. So we have a shortage of knowledge on that area. So that's something that we need to look at. How did we choose the experts? The experts were chosen from 3 sectors because that's what the project could actually accommodate. We chose people from the sort of the SAT, policy, and private sector. And that also gave us a number of individuals. And this was the first meeting that we had in Accra, in Ghana. And thankfully, we had our first meeting with all the experts who were there. Some of you are here, were in that particular meeting. And we are expecting more of this coming soon. And then, of course, these experts came from different societies or different sectors. So we had the SAT, government, and so forth. And as you can see, not all the 3 are the only experts. Each country has an option to ensure that they can increase the number of experts in their countries. Lastly, in terms of the knowledge modules, this is what I wanted to talk about. The knowledge modules, as I said, are what we call best practice. They have got 3 functions in the knowledge modules. We are dealing with the priorities that we identified, as you can see there. There is the issue around communicating, which is very critical when it comes to knowledge modules, and also the issues around bridging the gender gap. In communicating, I think we need to make sure that we address those issues quite well. We've done what we call the knowledge modules, which have been developed, and we have knowledge modules that have different components. We've been working with Diplo to make sure that those are developed. That's the list of some of the knowledge modules that we have and that we've developed, and also they're accessible online. So you can go online, you can access the knowledge modules, and these knowledge modules we've been doing what we call enhancement for member countries to understand how they work. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about one thing here. It's important that we look at sustainment. And as I said earlier, our agenda is to make sure that we can sustain the project. So what are we trying to do? We have what we call the clearinghouse process, where all member states can be able to let us know what are the critical issues out of the priorities that I talked about that they want to be addressed. There is also the participation of the communities, which we've been holding, the inclusivity of women and girls, and I was very glad that we had a session here that really emphasized on women in cyber, and that is something that we really emphasize in this particular project. So that's something that we've taken very seriously. We've got also other coordinating committee that has been set up of organizations that are participating in this at a different level. And lastly, we are looking at enhancing the knowledge modules so that they can be in different languages, so that we have languages such as Spanish, Swahili, and others, and Portuguese that is spoken in the African continent. Offline access to make sure that we can be able to tackle issues of accessibility, and then looking at incentive mechanisms of people who want to build career out of the ACE community that we have to be able to be part of this particular capacity building, so that next time there is a need in a different country, we simply come to you and you'll be able to do that. This is how the project is panned out. It's quite elaborative. We are ending in October, but I think we're going to extend it to next year, roughly about March, and we are now doing a lot of issues. That's where we are, and we are now doing what we call enhancement sessions, where we take everybody through the modules to understand them better, for them to give us feedback, for us to know exactly what we need to do. And of course, lastly, we are going to have a meeting again in Congo, Brazzaville, and if you are in this room and you belong to Kenya and you've not heard about this particular project, please see me and then we can be able to have a chat. Thank you.
I love how we connect.